I'm Jenna Seery, a bookseller and associate producer of Poured Over, and today I am so excited to be joined by Tananarive Due, the award-winning author of The Wishing Pool, The Between, The Good House, and now one of the most striking horror novels I have ever read, The Reformatory. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Oh, I'm thrilled to be here.
I'd love if we could start with just having you set up the story a little bit for us, because this novel is it's just something very special, I think, in the world of horror, where it has a lot of personal ties, it has a lot of real world ties, and it has a very special story with a lot of heart. So I was hoping you could set it up for us.
Well, sure. You know, it really started out of grief. I lost my mother in 2012. And really shortly after she passed away, I got a call from the Florida State Attorney's Office letting me know that she had a relative who'd been buried on the grounds of the Dozier School for Boys in Marianna, Florida, which at the time I had never heard of. I had never heard of the Dozier School for Boys, which was this horrific institution that was open from about 1900 till I think 2011, more than 100 years, generations of abuse. The state of Florida literally just passed reparations for survivors of the Dozier School. So that's very exciting. That just happened this year. But back then, I had never heard of the Dozier School. His name was Robert Stevens, and he died there when he was 15 years old, and that's all I knew. And when my father, who is an attorney, John Dorsey Due Jr., he's 90 now. So this goes back a ways. He was a young, spry 80-year-old guy, probably the first time we went to the meeting. We heard testimonies from white and Black survivors of the Dozier School, of the beatings they had suffered, of the abuse they had suffered. And I thought, oh my God, I have to write something. I didn't know at the time it would be a novel, but I wanted to write a story. Actually, I did decide it would have to be a novel because honestly, the true story, ew. I mean, that's not inspirational. That's not fun to write. And believe me, this was not fun to write either. But what really drove me was that I wanted to give Robert Stevens a different story.
The first time I read the description of the book and sort of just let the idea of what it was going to be sink in, it is something where I wasn't sure, reading the beginning, I was like, this feels like a historical novel. The horror piece really crept up slowly on me in a way that I really appreciate, because I was so immersed by the time that I was scared, and then I was scared. But I think that there's something so special about a book that can fulfill all these boxes of being something historical and realistic and true, but also providing us that entertainment, that space that we can also immerse ourselves in, and in a way that doesn't drag us completely down as we read.
I love the use of the word entertainment, because I think that's something that sometimes horror creators who are a little over earnest about showcasing terrible things from history can forget that horror, I think by very definition, is supposed to be entertaining. We know life is full of horror. We see that every day in our lives, our losses, the headlines. The thing about horror is that it's supposed to be scary, ultimately in a fun way. Not always, maybe every second, but when you put it down, it should feel like you've been through a roller coaster ride instead of you've been chopped up into little pieces and you don't want to crawl from under your covers. It's like taking the edge out, and that's where the fantasy element comes in. And that's why I knew I had to make this a ghost story. And, kind of funny sidebar, Erin Kemmerly, who is one of the researchers who was at the Dozier School exhuming the bodies, and Robert Stevens' remains were found there recently. She said there were ghost stories. Of course there were. I mean, if you know anything about the Dozier School, it would not be the least bit surprising that there were ghost stories. Although, ironically, I never talked to anybody about ghost stories or ghost experiences. I just took that for granted. Hell yeah, this place is haunted. And this is what haunting looks like and feels like to me. And it was my way of being honest about the fact that so many young people died at this institution without having to do page after page after page. Okay, here's another dead kid. Oh, here's another dead kid. Oh, this kid's dead. That's not fun. Nobody wants to read that. So So yeah, it was trying to, and as the author, absorbing the real life stories and trying to figure out how much of this can I put in a novel and still make it entertaining was my toughest journey because I have all those stories locked in my head and I don't mention them even in interviews when if I can help it because they're just terrible and they're children.
And if we know something about kids and being a kid, I think telling ghost stories and, trying to scare each other and your friends is a big part. Like that something about that just clicks, right? When you have these young people, they're experiencing things that are beyond comprehension. Of course, they're going to apply a little bit of that lens to it. And for us as former kids, I guess,
yes,
you can look at it in that same way, I think.
I think so. And ghost stories, that feeling of a safe scare is very, very comforting to me personally. And I think the reason is because horror makes sense of the bad things that happen. It's not that bad things don't happen. It's not that bad things don't happen to good people. That happens in horror all the time. But there's a reason it's happening. There was a curse, wrong place, wrong time. At least you get like some sort of sense of order from it. It might still not be fair, but there's order, there's explanation, there's a reason for it. Whereas in real life, I'm like, what in the world would make adults act this way toward children for all these generations? Because you can't even just blame one person. I mean, the one thing I kind of regret about the Reformatory is that Warden Haddock, the primary antagonist in the story, he's so terrible that he comes across as like the only reason that this place is crappy. And in fact, there were, many different wardens and many different people who came through that place. And it was an institutionalized barbarity that everyone just fell into. And that's scarier to me than real life when you can say, okay, well, that guy is definitely a sociopath. And no wonder, why are you putting a sociopath in charge of children or psychopath? I forget. He's one of them. Maybe he's both of them. I don't know.
I do love the idea that horror can provide us this space where it feels safe to digest certain things that are going on. I think I don't always like to use this term, but I'll use it in air quotes, genre fiction, where, in fantasy, in horror, in speculative, that you're able to access some of these things that are really very contemporary and very current and very prevalent. But there is this just shifting the lens over a little bit allows it to seep in a little bit better and a little bit differently. And it really works in this book to find these atrocities, but you're still able to work through and push through and keep reading. And for me, keep reading in one sitting because I could not stop.
Oh, wow. Well, that is amazing. And I wish I could have written it in one sitting. I'm very jealous. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think also the historical aspect of this novel gives the reader a little bit of emotional distance, even though if you're paying attention to headlines and if you know anything about mass incarceration and so-called juvenile justice, you realize that a lot of these issues are still alive and well. Like if the police knock on your door and want to put your child in chains and lock your child in a chain, there's really nothing you can do about it in 2024 or 2025, just like there was very little to do about it in 1950. Now, maybe in 1950, if you were Black, it was obviously worse. But at the same time, we have a much, much bigger prison population than we ever could have dreamed of having in 1950. So there are balances, and there is this contemporary, one of my favorite reviews was someone who said it was a call to action. And that was like, oh, yes, because yes, you see what I'm doing there. Even though it's set in 1950, it was very much meant to reflect things that are still happening today. But as you said, from more of a safe distance where you can sit back, digest it, not take it as personally, while you're reading the story of one young man, Robert, 12-year-old Robert Stevens, who has been unjustly locked up in this terrible haunted reformatory, while his 17-year-old sister is trying to get him free. And I think everyone can relate to that, whether or not you have a sibling. What would you do? And my North Star while I was writing this was asking myself, what would my mother have done? My late mother, Patricia Stevens, she never dropped her name Stevens when she got married. Robert Stevens was her uncle. And I just think, oh, of course, he died in the 1930s. I did change that in the novel from the 1930s to 1950. But if she had been his sister, she would have moved heaven and earth to change what happened to him, to make sure everybody heard about it, everybody knew about it. I think a lot of people suffered in silence, white families and Black families, because the white families caught up in the Dozier School were poor and under-resourced, and the Black families were under Jim Crow, often poor and frightened. If you speak up, your house gets burned down. So there was a conspiracy of silence, I think, around this facility that I wanted people to break through and learn about. And I'm just very excited that it's found an audience.
I think for me, something that really set this book apart from so many, I think sometimes horror gets a reputation of being very plot focused. It's very much about what is happening, but the voices of Robert and Gloria in this book truly are a through line that is so easy to just sink into. I really immediately felt like I knew both of them and could understand and hear them. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of finding their voices and how you were able to bring that to the page.
Thank you for that. That is a high, high compliment. I love child characters. My husband, Stephen Barnes, and I co-authored a couple of YA zombie novels, Devil's Wake and Domino Falls. But even when it's not YA, and that's the only YA I've done, I have written a ton of child protagonists. There's just something about the purity, the courage. Like they don't have the example of this doesn't work. So they're like, let's try this. And that's why, at least traditionally, young people lead political movements for change, because they don't have that disability of feeling like no matter what you do, you can't change this. This is just the way it is, which people start to embrace as they get older. So Robert was easy for me to find. 12 is a great age. You're starting to discern the world around you a little bit more sharply. He's mature for a 12-year-old because he's had to be. Their dad isn't there, literally. So they're basically raising themselves right now. And he has a power of perception, both literally as a young person, seeing things in the way people behave, noticing things in the warden's office that other people don't notice, but also he has this sensitivity to the ghost realm, and they're called haints in the world of this book. So basically his sensitivity to haints, and all children in Gracetown have it to some degree, to me is sort of a metaphor for the way children are so sensitive and the way they do pick up on so much. And as we get older, we lose some of that imagination. We lose that kind of deeper perception, and we just sort of fall in line. And Gloria is sort of in the middle of that. She's halfway to adulthood because she has this huge responsibility of taking care of her brother even before he gets locked up. And it's an even worse responsibility after he's locked up. So she's starting to sort of fade from childhood. She's not as sensitive as Robert, but yet she does have this extra discernment where she can kind of sense what people's futures will be, things that will happen. She can't see her own future, doggone it, but if she meets somebody, and a lot of real life people are mentioned in this book. Harry Timor was a real life civil rights activist who was martyred in the 1950s. And she can sense, oh, wow, something is about to happen to this guy, which again, it's that homage to young people's perception. And she was a tougher character to find. She lives a lot in her head. Not as much happens to her on a daily basis as happens to Robert. Like he's always dealing with something. Like every door he opens is leading to something new and terrible. Whereas Gloria, I mean, yeah, she's on a quest to save him. But even under Jim Crow, she's living a quieter life. And I worried sometimes that she was too much in her head, too much being sort of like I see her, I never really mentioned this, but I really feel like in the future, Gloria was going to be a writer. Like she has that kind of poet's way of looking at the world. And sometimes I worried that she was spending too much time in her head.
I love going along with both of them, especially in the way that I think works particularly well for young people, protagonists in books where there's a lot happening to them, where you feel like they don't always know what to do, and you're scared because they don't know what to do, and you wish that you could just like whisper to them advice into the book, because that's how I felt, like making certain choices and being like, oh no, like you can see it before they do, because they're pushing up against this world that is against them at every turn.
Big. There are things Gloria does that no adult, like any adult with sense, would be like, that is a total waste of our time.
Yes, there's certain things that I was like, no, please don't do that. No, to the page. But then we're along with them, and we're watching them make these choices. And sometimes it is hard. As much as I was like flying through this, there were a couple moments where I had to like pause at the end of a chapter and be like, am I ready?
Woo. And I have to shout out the audio reader also, Janice Abbott Pratt. She does such a supernaturally good job of rendering these children's voices that often readers are like, oh my God, the readers were so great. No, honey, it's reader, singular. She did all the voices and she sounds just like these kids. So it's, for me, listening to that, which is the only way I can really engage with my own work. It's just hard to read your own work, but if someone's reading it for me, I can kind of relax. I agree with you. There were moments that I had forgotten were going to be like just like crash into a wall. Like, oh, that sucks. That hurt. Woo, let me take a breath. And yeah, I know what you mean.
I love when I'm reading a book and I feel like I'm able to put something in and get something out at the same time. And I think that goes very well with these characters, where you really feel like you're able to connect with them and have, it's not like a one-way reading experience, because your heart is right there with them. I think that goes well too with this idea that there are a lot of characters in this book. These two kids meet a lot of people and create a very like intricate ensemble in a way, but everyone felt real and right. I particularly love Miss Lottie. I think that her voice was so helpful to me as I was reading to feel connected. But you have a lot of wonderful characters.
I appreciate that. Ms. Lottie was named after my grandmother, and she doesn't have many resources. She doesn't have much education, but oh my gosh, thank goodness she's there for Gloria, just first to have someone to talk to. And also, she's closer to the end of life. She's in her 80s. So Ms. Lottie has shed some of her inhibitions. And she has a kind of boldness to do things that Gloria would never think of doing, because you get to that age where you're like, oh, I don't care. What are they going to do to me? So I loved bringing her energy in. Ultimately, though, even though this isn't a YA novel, in the spirit of a YA novel, it is that the young people have to be responsible for their own agency, their own outcome. There's no single adult. There are a lot of adults along the way who give little piece of advice. Her employer, Miss Ann, gives a little money. She gets this hint from this adult, and there's a lawyer who tries to help. But ultimately, it's up to Robert. With help from Gloria, it's up to Robert. And that was exciting to write.
It really gives this feeling of a train just speeding down a track. I think something that really stuck with me, and I kept coming back to this idea that I think we don't always think of, especially as adults, but especially when you're a kid, that feeling that one decision can set off this domino effect that you can't stop. That,
yes.
One singular event changes everything for these two.
And it's such a simple thing. I mean, I don't think it's spoilery to say that what sets off the events of this novel is like two kids walking to school, minding their own business, might I add. Gloria and her brother walking to school on a dirt road next to a very big estate ranch by the richest family in town. And their teenage son used to be a playmate, which was true even in the Deep South. Black and white kids would play together when they were younger. But then those social barriers would kick in. And now he's 16, so he's sir, he's not their friend anymore, but he's making advances toward Gloria, and it's very confusing to Robert, and Gloria's doing her best to navigate it, but it leads to Robert kicking this guy. She's like, get away from my sister kind of thing. And that is and might I add, the other kid pushed Robert first. So really, if anybody needed to go to the reformatory, it was that other kid, but that's not how it works. Rich son of a planter is not going to a reformatory for 6 months, but poor Negro child, yes, you can go to the reformatory. And I absolutely agree with you about that notion of how one moment can change everything. Anyone who's had a sudden loss, anyone who's known anyone who was in a car accident, I mean, those, like, if only you had done this instead of that, if only, it's so maddening, in fact, to just want to reach back in time and change this one little thing that had a tragic outcome. And that's definitely the case here. There are so many things that could have been different where this never would have happened if they had left at a different time. If that guy just hadn't been standing there, it's like, it's maddening.
And I think especially when you're a kid, you don't know how to combat that. I mean, you just don't understand. You don't have enough experience in the world yet. And everything, 6 months when you're 12 years old is forever.
That's a long time.
You haven't lived that long yet. That's a huge portion of your life. And to be confronted with that. And I think, like you said, Robert is very mature, but I think back to being 12 and, in even some of the choices he makes, it's like 12 is so interesting because you are starting to become older, but you do still have moments where you're a kid and you need someone to support you and love you and be there for you.
And you need to play. Those are some of my most fun moments from writing the story. We're really trying to tap into that childlike spirit. They want, will you be my friend? They just want someone who'll talk to them, be nice to them. We can chase each other. We can race each other. We can play in the freezer, even though that is such a scary moment because playing in a freezer feels dangerous, even if you're not at a Jim Crow reformatory that's haunted. So probably not a good idea, but it's exactly what a 12-year-old boy would do. And I love those moments of just pure, I don't care where we are, you and I are having fun and we're going to play.
And I think that's really accurate for life and for the world, that when you are that age or when you're an adult, I mean, even when the worst things are happening, you are still a human who is living life and experiencing different emotions. Even when everything is really bad, you can still find some joy.
Yeah, and I think that was Robert's superpower. As I was working on the story, I asked myself, what is Robert's superpower? And it is his adaptability. It's his, like, I'm going to take a minute to be playful. I'm going to take a minute to listen to this radio program and laugh. There's Haynes here. I'm going to have to pivot and figure out that in a way. Like I always say, I think I would have done a far worse job of thriving or surviving this reformatory than Robert did because I can't even imagine it, first of all. But as an adult, again, I don't have those same skills to adapt. I'm sure I would in some regard, but I think he does it so well. A, because he's a child, but B, because he's Robert. That's who he is.
I really love getting to watch him grow over. I think he has a wonderful arc where he is able to be so different and to learn. You really get to watch him learn so many things as he goes through. And I think that that's so much fun about reading protagonists that age, is like watching them make choices, make mistakes, and then be confronted with something and do something different. Right. I think especially in horror, that there's so much room to play there.
Absolutely. Well, in horror, you do not want to see characters making the same mistakes over and over again. So that was important to me that he would pivot. It's like, oh, okay, now I've got to do it this way. And he's always got his eye on, like, oh, there are no bars on the windows. I wonder why people don't try to run away. And he's like always trying to work it out in his head.
I think if all those things are his superpower, something that I was like, this is your downfall, is sometimes the vocal processing. I'm like, no, sometimes do just keep it in your head. Don't say it out loud.
True. He is very verbal. Especially with Warden Haddock. Oh my goodness. Oh my gosh. Just take a hint from all these other kids and back away slowly.
I'd love to talk to you a little bit about maybe the research piece, if there was, what all that entailed for you. I know this book was a labor of love, a long labor of writing, because not only is there all the historical piece, but even just the aspect of atmosphere. I really felt like I was in Florida. I felt the heat. I felt the nature. There's a lot of good tactility in that as well.
Well, thank you for that. I grew up in Florida, although I grew up in Miami, which is very, very different from Northern Florida, which is where my fictitious town of Gracetown is located. It's modeled on a combination of Marianna, Florida, which is where the real life Dozier School was, and Quincy, Florida, which is where my mom grew up, and I visited very often in her last years of life. So I had a very, very clear picture of those roads, that red clay soil, like you say, the heat, all of that, all of those details. And beyond that, the other research piece was just what was it like to be there? I got some initial feedback from the people I met, the survivors I met who were at that one event, but I continued to reach out to people by phone. And you find out little snippets like one woman told me that her brother was sent there and basically they got paid $50 for sending the brother there. It's like, oh, okay. Or people would get $50 for hunting children when they ran away, or just these, and really most devastating of all, I cannot overemphasize, was reading the memoirs. I do not have the list of all of them in front of me. Erin Kimberly wrote a book called We Carry These Bones, which has more details about the true life Robert Stevens and others who were actually at the facility. But there were several survivors who wrote memoirs, which is one of the reasons I decided early on to write it as fiction. I wasn't there. That was not my story specifically. Many others, even like in the last year or two, more and more memoirs are coming out, have written white and black. So there's one memoir from a white survivor who was a football star, and he talked about how detrimental that was because they didn't want to let him go because he was a football star. It like really masqueraded as a school, which is one of the most diabolical aspects of it. People played against their team in the high school football leagues. They marched in the Christmas parade. They were very well integrated into the town of Marianna, which is why I think there's been some denial from contemporary townspeople about how devastating this facility was, because so many people went through there as employees. It was literally the too big to fail of small town Americana. They had the printing press for the county. They grew the corn for the county. So even though it had all these terrible reports, like literally from day one, like you're shackling children. And sometimes children were only sent there for being orphans. It's like they didn't do anything. There's a character in there named Blue who was just sent there because there was no one else to take care of him. So he was an orphan, and that was what the system did to him. And then other minor infractions. So we're not talking about a bunch of murderers who were sent to this facility. And that research was killing. Oh my gosh, it was killing me. It was so, so hard to hear about the abuse, even secondhand, like a white survivor who talked about how he had a black friend who just disappeared. And I'm not even going to say what happened to that child, because it's like, who would do that? Who would do that to a child? But carrying those stories, carrying the knowledge that this was a real place, it was both a delay for me in terms of how quickly I could write the book, because I had to recover every time I read a new memoir, and it was so long for me to get through these memoirs. But also I considered it a big responsibility, a really big responsibility to get it right within the realm of fiction. And since I've published it, I've heard stories that were even worse than what I said. There was a whipping shed they called the White House. I renamed it the Fun House, just to be super evil in my book. But this survivor told me, and this was a Black survivor, told me while I was on book tour, that if you moved or you made a sound during a whipping, they would start from the beginning again at number one. And I, as a fiction writer, I didn't have a mind diabolical enough to think of that. It's like, wow, or if you're walking on the sidewalk, if you step onto the grass, you're going to get sent to the whipping shed. I'm like, what? Like, I didn't have the imagination. I'm a horror writer, and I didn't have the imagination to come up with these real life stories that happened to children. And that means it took me 7 years to write this book. And it felt like most of that time I was researching, but actually most of that time I was procrastinating. And the thing that really knocked me into gear was 2020 COVID. Back in the days of no toilet paper, everyone's watching The Tiger King, we're all thinking we're going to die. I really thought, oh my gosh, I cannot even entertain the possibility that I might die without finishing this book. So I got on a strict quota, like 3 to 5 pages per day. I put a chart up on my wall. I went away to a cabin for a couple of days, and I just kept working on it feverishly for that last bit to get it done.
And I appreciate all the work you did. And I think so many people appreciate the work from this book. I mean, even just going online and seeing some of the responses to this book, it's really special the way people are connecting to it and loving it.
I have no words for that, to tell you the truth. I put everything I can in everything I write. If I would not have guessed that the response to this book would be so different from my other books. Part of it might be timing, where more people are embracing genre and are embracing, our voices, as it's called. Like, because I personally, as a horror fan, love it when I'm experiencing horror from another culture. And I think by very definition, because horror is so based on surprise and novelty, you really can't get like scared watching the same thing or reading the same thing over and over and over again. So if I read The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones, or if I read, House of Bone and Rain by Gabino Iglesias, I'm getting a glimpse into a different culture that adds to that feeling of unease and adds to that feeling of being sort of off center, not knowing what's going to happen next. So that may have something to do with it, but I am just, you want to put lightning in a bottle. If I could write every book to have this response, I would. But I'll just stick to the idea that I was trying to tell a thrilling story, first of all, because again, horror is entertainment. I always want to write a page turner, but it really was about something underneath. And while I hope that's true of everything I write, I am floored by the response to the Reformatory. I never would have guessed that so many people would be so interested in the story of a little Black boy and his sister in 1950s Florida.
I love you mentioning that this is just a really good time to read horror, I think, in this world.
Yes.
There is just so many new voices, so many voices of people that are really being able to tell their story for the first time. There's so much now that I'm like, if for all of the readers, if you've ever wanted to start horror reading, now's a really good time.
Now is an amazing time.
And I think I consider you a bit of a horror scholar as well, maybe more than a bit of a horror scholar. You are a horror scholar as well. And you teach, and you are really, I think, on the forefront of bringing a lot of this to people. And I would just want you to, if you can talk a little bit about teaching horror and working with students and how that sort of informs your career as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, I started teaching at UCLA a few years ago because the full-time life of an artist was not for me, with the ups and the downs. I like more of a steady through line in my life. So the happy part is I love teaching. And when I saw the movie Get Out by Jordan Peele, I knew, oh my gosh, I have to teach a course called The Sunken Place, which is all about Black horror and the history of Black horror. And I was an executive producer on Horror Noir, A History of Black Horror, which was also the same thing. And Jordan Peele came to my classroom, which kind of went viral. And so many people were interested in it that my husband and I started a digital course for people who want to learn. Honestly, it goes all the way back really before this, but to W.E.B. Du Bois, who is known mostly as a scholar and anti-lynching activist, but he also wrote science fiction and horror to do, in many ways, the same thing Jordan Peele was trying to do and Get Out almost 100 years later. And I find that fascinating, how people have discovered over time that you can unpack really difficult issues. Like in Du Bois's time, it was lynching. In contemporary times, it might be police profiling or appropriation of Black bodies and Get Out. But you can use this fantasy lens to give people the distance and help them learn that history. And I give my students the chance to write either a short story, an essay, or make a short film. Several students, even if they've never made a short film, will do the film. Several students will write the short stories. And I love the idea that by teaching, I'm also kind of trying to cultivate the next generation of artists. Some people who didn't even know they were artists, like they were planning to go to law school. And I'm sure I have many parents who have wanted to strangle me because their child who is headed for business school or law school has decided, I want to get an MFA and write fiction. Sorry, mom. But that makes me so happy when people get the freedom to express themselves creatively and then go out there and thrive. And I don't just teach at UCLA. Steve and I also have online courses. So I would just encourage everyone to join my mailing list at tananarivdelist.com so you can hear more about the teaching I do outside of UCLA and also all the great stories that may come next.
I've been a horror fan, I feel like my whole life. I feel like it's just one of those things that as soon as I saw my first horror movies as a kid, even though I was like, why do I like this? It's just one of those things that once it becomes a part of you and you realize that what these stories are actually telling and what they're actually talking about. Sure, sometimes it's just a slasher and it's just to be scary, and that can be great too. But there are also all these moments where you're like, oh, wait, you're trying to teach me something here. And I love when those things collide.
To be fair, I will watch just about anything. I will watch just the slashers, like the random, because that's why it's happening, because I said so. That, there's no big lesson. Or something that is thought-provoking, like something like The Dark and the Wicked, which is a film that I love and not a lot of people have seen, that the underpinning is grief. And as someone who's been a caretaker when my mother was ill, and like I said, my dad is 90, rather than triggering me because that caretaking piece is a part of the story, it takes me through this terrible horror journey where I'm like, you know what? My situation is not really that bad compared to what they're going through. So let me chill out with my self-pity and just be glad it's not also a possession with a demon involved, because that would be way worse.
Right. Thank you, horror, for reminding us it could always be just a little bit worse.
Can always be worse. Just because there's order doesn't mean it's not worse.
Exactly. I would love to talk a little bit about some of your literary influences. Who makes you a reader? Who makes you a writer? And some people that you love.
Wow. Okay. This is always the toughest one.
I know.
I have to go back, like almost every horror writer you've ever spoken to, I'm sure, to the fact that my mother gave me my first Stephen King novel, The Shining, when I was 16. And King, I just saw him on Threads the other day. Someone was saying, what would your advice be if I want to write a horror story? It's like, make sure you write characters the reader cares about. And that's his whole brand. I mean, I think a lot of people mistake the success for Stephen King of just, it's scary stuff. It's not that. It's scary stuff happening to people who are real, who feel real, that you care about. And that is number one. And there are a lot of writers who are accomplishing that these days. But in terms of my formative, I discovered her later than I wish, but Octavia Butler, obviously, in her unflinching way of looking at problems in society and trying to come up with a fantasy or science fiction answer to those problems, is something that I can really relate to. But I also like, on a contemporary level, the writers I've mentioned, but also oh my gosh, there's so many. Alma Katsu, I love. The writers, like, if you see they publish a book, you're going to pick it up immediately. So that would be Stephen Graham Jones and Gabino Iglesias, of course, still Stephen King. Johnny Compton, who's a fairly new writer. Erin E. Adams, who wrote Jackal, which again has sort of a societal mirror about missing Black girls. I am just super thrilled by the number of artists who have embraced horror, who could really be writing anything. They could have just chosen to be straight literary writers, but they've decided that horror is their home, and I'm thrilled.
I love that. I love the connections we're now able to make in horror, that it's not just like, oh, these are just those pulpy mass markets that you find on the spinner in the back of, a store. It's front and center, and people are really connecting to it.
Yes, they are. Thank goodness. It's a better world with horror in it.
Absolutely. I know we've talked a little bit about the reception to the Reformatory, but now with that coming out in paperback, we're going to have a whole new crew of readers coming to it. So do you have someone that you really hope picks up the book, sort of someone that you would love to walk into a bookstore and find it on a table or a shelf?
Well, besides Barnes and Noble. No. I mean, that honestly, that anywhere, because people take pictures of my books, as we call it, in the wild.
Mhm.
But as the author, it is very rare to be out in public and see someone reading your book. Like if I walked on a plane and I saw someone reading my book, I would probably faint. And that would be a dream for me. I would love to walk on a plane, walk into an airport bookstore and see a book. I don't think that's ever happened for me. So I have high hopes that maybe that will happen. But in terms of sort of an individual reader, it's always, you never know who you're reaching. So the idea that someone who doesn't yet know that they're a writer, who would have the kind of reaction to the Reformatory, like feeling both seen, but also inspired, and also, oh my gosh, I didn't even know we could do this with horror, to help inspire someone in the future, that's the dream.
I think there are a lot of people who are really going to find this one and love it. You mentioned a little bit that this book took you 7 years to write, but is there anything on the horizon you'd like to talk about? Anything coming up next?
Well, absolutely, because I've learned my lesson from the Reformatory. Rather than saying yes to everything and putting off my primary work, I'm basically saying no to a lot so I can continue to work on my next primary work. So I won a World Fantasy Award for a short story called Incident at Bear Creek Lodge. And it's semi-historical. It takes place in the 70s. It's a creature story with a backstory in old Hollywood. And I wrote a story called Return to Bear Creek Lodge, which is in Christmas and Other Horrors, which was edited by Ellen Datlow. And I thought, you know what? I'm feeling like this wants to be a novel. And sure enough, it did. So I'm more than halfway through what I'm calling right now Bear Creek Lodge.
I can't wait. I think after the success and the love for the Reformatory, I think that you're definitely going to be on a lot of people's lists of must-buys after this, and especially with the long career of so many great works that you've had. I think we will all be very excited for whatever comes next.
I appreciate that. And you won't have to wait 7 years in between novels anymore. And as an Easter egg to readers who discovered me through the Reformatory, this novel actually opens in Gracetown as well.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining us and talking with us today about the Reformatory, which is out in paperback now, and I cannot wait for people to get their hands on it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.